This is the USS Enterprise, the single most important Allied ship in the entire world in November of 1942. Had the weather in the Central Pacific been different nearly a year prior, Enterprise would be sitting at the bottom of Pearl Harbor, completely changing the course of world history. So why was the Enterprise so important? To understand this, we have to take a look at naval history. The Enterprise is an aircraft carrier, a massive naval vessel that is essentially a floating airport. When she was built in the late 1930s, she was only the sixth one ever built by the United States Navy. At this point in naval history, carriers were seen as secondary fleet assets. World War I years earlier proved that battleships were the main fleet asset the Navy could have. Carriers with their aircraft could certainly expand the search radius of a fleet and play strong defensive roles, but there was no way that aircraft could take out a battleship, at least that was the thinking at the time. Halfway across the world in November 1940, the British Royal Navy managed to attack an anchoring of Italian warships with carrier-based torpedo bombers. The surprising level of damage inflicted was noticed in particular by one individual, Imperial Japanese Navy Commander-in-Chief Isoroku Yamamoto. Having studied at Harvard and been the naval attaché at the Japanese embassy in Washington, Admiral Yamamoto knew that war against the United States would be borderline impossible. Most of Japan's oil came from the States. The US was already not thrilled that the Japanese Empire was expanding their territory in the Eastern world and Pacific. Oil-rich Indonesia was certainly off limits, especially with a heavy US presence in the Philippines. The only way Yamamoto thought Japan could win a war in the Pacific was if the American fleet could be decimated in a large surprise attack while simultaneously invading Indonesia and the Philippines to secure access to oil. Such a surprise attack would have been impossible with conventional naval doctrine at the time. However, he now saw that naval carrier aircraft would be the spear tip of a surprise attack force. Yamamoto made it clear that carriers needed to be the primary target at Pearl Harbor. It was imperative to remove the US Navy of its greatest asset that they don't even realize they have. Yamamoto's combined fleet steamed towards Hawaii with 6 aircraft carriers in late November of 1941. Meanwhile, US intelligence had an inkling that an attack could be possible, but certainly not at their primary anchoring in Pearl Harbor. At this time, they had 3 aircraft carriers in their Pacific fleet, one of them being USS Enterprise. Her task force is due back at Pearl Harbor on the afternoon of the 6th of December after delivering aircraft and supplies to Wake Island, some 2,300 miles west of Pearl. 2 other carriers, Lexington and Saratoga, were carrying out other supply escort missions, keeping them away from the harbor. While Enterprise's group steamed back east towards Pearl, the Japanese fleet was doing the same 1,000 miles to their north. While making their voyage, both of these fleets would share a common enemy, Mother Nature. Northeast of Hawaii is the notorious high-pressure system known as the North Pacific High. Its steady presence is responsible for trade winds that flow from the US West Coast through the Hawaiian Islands. During the winter months, it is typically weaker or nearly non-existent. However, in the first days of December of 1941, it was abnormally strong for this time of year. As the Japanese combined fleet continued eastward from northern Japan, following them was a strong northern low. While it made for miserable conditions for the sailors on board, this storm system would keep the Japanese armada hidden by cloud cover and high seas. Patrolling aircraft or submarines would not be able to spot the flotilla. 1,000 miles to their south, Enterprise and her escort ships were feeling the effects of what happens when a blocking high and a strong low-pressure system interact. The large difference in pressures causes a massive volume of air to flow from the high to the low. Surface winds pick up greatly, which in turn creates massive swells on the open ocean. Enterprise, at over 800 feet in length, could handle the rough seas fairly well, but her supporting cast of smaller destroyers were being battered by the waves. Sustained gale force winds deplete the smaller warships of their fuel quickly, forcing Enterprise to slow down and refuel the vessels. It became clear to Vice Admiral Bull Halsey that they would not be making it back to Pearl Harbor for their scheduled return date. While the men of the fleet would be disappointed that their shore leaves would be cut short, the rough seas of the 5th and 6th of December would keep them from meeting a near certain death on the morning of the 7th. 230 miles north of Pearl Harbor, Japanese rotary engines roared to life on the decks of 6 flat tops. Once the warplanes broke through the overcast, they were greeted by the red rising sun, perfect symbolism for how the day was about to unfold. The Japanese attack waves navigate to Pearl and are greeted by partly cloudy skies. The northern Pacific High has kept the thick cloud cover away from Hawaii. They commence their attack on the U.S. naval anchoring. As multiple battleships, cruisers, and destroyers are worked over by Japanese attack aircraft, notably absent are American aircraft carriers. USS Enterprise and her battle group are still 150 miles outside of Pearl Harbor. The United States is now at war when Enterprise finally pulls into port the evening of the 8th. From Enterprise, Admiral Halsey, who had been the Navy's most vocal advocate for aircraft carriers, vows to bring the fight to the Japanese as he sees Pearl Harbor still smoldering. The attack has more than opened the eyes of the rest of the US Navy. Though losing most of their battleships is a huge blow to the Pacific Fleet, it is clear now that aircraft carriers are the main fleet asset moving forward, and the US only has 3 versus Japan's 10. In the coming weeks, carriers Yorktown and Wasp are brought from the Atlantic, and the newly built Hornet quickly is commissioned into service. In 1942, engagements between Japanese and US fleets were heavily focused on knocking out each other's carriers. The Lexington would be sunk in May at the Battle of the Coral Sea. In June, the infamous Battle of Midway allowed the US to sink 4 of the 6 Japanese carriers that attacked Pearl, but at the cost of the Yorktown. Many say that Midway was the turning point of the war in the Pacific, but that really isn't the true story. This would be proven at the many naval battles around the Guadalcanal campaign in the back half of 1942. Saratoga would be heavily damaged and the Wasp would be sunk, both victims of submarine torpedoes. The mainland US was still trying to get its industrial might back together in order to build new aircraft carriers, but the lingering effects of the Great Depression made it slow to get shipyards up to speed. This left Enterprise and Hornet as the last 2 carriers in the Pacific to fight the crucial Guadalcanal campaign. A loss at Guadalcanal was not an option, as it made a perfect base for operations for the Japanese to invade Australia, fundamentally shifting the entire war in the Pacific. In late October 1942, Enterprise and Hornet would engage the Japanese carrier group outside of the Santa Cruz Islands. Mother Nature would once again save the Enterprise, as her battle group would be covered by a tropical rain squall as the first attack wave approached. Her sister ship would not be as fortunate. The Hornet would be hit by multiple bombs, torpedoes, and kamikazes. Enterprise would be hit by the second wave, but would ultimately survive as the last battle-ready carrier in the Pacific. At the pinnacle of the Guadalcanal campaign, Enterprise's aircraft destroyed critical Japanese resupply ships that were trying to reinforce the island, as they ultimately were trying to run the Marines off of Guadalcanal. Enterprise almost single-handedly kept the Marines from being overrun on the island. Had Enterprise been lost at Pearl Harbor nearly a year prior, the war in the Pacific would look entirely different. Enterprise's involvement at Midway was critical in the sinking of the 4 Japanese carriers. Had Enterprise not been in the Midway equation, the United States would have likely lost both Hornet and Yorktown. The Japanese carrier superiority then would be a 5-to-1 advantage, and would almost guarantee a victory for Japan in Guadalcanal, the precursor for an Australian invasion. It is impossible to say that this would have resulted in a Japanese victory in the war, but ultimately it would have undoubtedly set back the Allies multiple years in the Pacific had the snowball of losing Enterprise at Pearl Harbor taken effect. The rough seas of early December 1941, while certainly a nuisance, ultimately saved war in the Pacific for the United States and its allies.